In this video, we'll finish up with Part 3 of the Human Population Dynamics and Resource Consumption topic. Our focus for this final video of this topic is going to be on water pollution. We'll look at different types of pollutants and the diverse problems they can cause for life forms and for human life as well. We don't need to know these exact details on this image. I kind of just like the picture, but we will talk a little bit about runoff and how that pollution gets into our water and can lead to the death of fish and other organisms. We'll also talk about certain metals like mercury getting into our water and how that can potentially make its way back to us in the foods that we eat. First of all, there are two different ways to categorize water pollution based upon where those pollutants are coming from. The first is a point source, in that you can point to it and there's one specific source that is directly releasing this pollution into our waterways. So a single, easily identifiable, confined and discrete source. Not like a huge parking lot, it's got to be like a pipe or a factory or somebody dumping oil directly down their drain after they change their oil in their car. This is in contrast to non-point sources. You can't point to one specific source. It's a bunch of diffuse sources. This would be like runoff from a parking lot, or the urine and manure made by cows from a field, or the excess fertilizer washing off a field, or things called septic systems in rural areas where human waste nutrients get discharged into the environment. All those would be considered non-point sources. There's no direct single source. How we develop our land affects how severe water pollution is, and it's related to how much runoff there is. Runoff is, rather than having water soak into the ground, it all kind of goes straight along this surface and then goes into our waterways more directly, more quickly. And that's not a good thing, because if you have what's called this infiltration, where the pollution that's in water can go through the ground, the bacteria that live in the ground, the rocks, the soil, the plants, etc., they're going to filter out a lot of that pollution, and it's not going to be nearly as harmful as in a city environment where you have a lot of the surface that's called impervious surface. Impervious means that water cannot pass through it. So if you have a lot of impervious surface, the water can't pass through. You have lots of runoff, where the water goes straight into our storm sewers, and that carries it to lakes, rivers, streams, etc., with all the pollution there. There's not a chance for it to get filtered out. And so what we're starting to see is, in our urban areas, we're recognizing the need for more green space, and we're trying to put more of that back in, more parks. You'll see green roofs, for example, coming in, where some buildings are putting plants and growing them on their rooftops, actually, to absorb some of the pollution. You're seeing sidewalks put in that are pervious, the opposite of impervious. They're pervious. They allow water to go through them into the ground to get filtered out. And so we're making steps in the right direction, but we still have a long way to go to reduce that. What's shown here is what's called a watershed. And a watershed is just a geographic area in which all of the water apologize for my terrible handwriting with this stylus here, drains into the same place. So here in this picture, we're seeing the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So it's this geographic area where all of the water, even if it's up here in this part of New York, eventually makes its way down into the Chesapeake Bay. So anywhere in this area, because of the topography of the land, that water is going to make its way into the Chesapeake Bay. And with it will carry some pollution. That's part of the reason why the Chesapeake Bay is not a very healthy body of water, because there's a lot of pollution from all the people that live in this area, the agriculture that you'll find in, say, upstate Maryland and parts of Pennsylvania as well. And so a lot of pollutants that get there. The biggest watershed in the country is the Mississippi River watershed. And you can see it drains almost half the country. It starts out in my home state of Minnesota as a very clean body of water. It's coming up from the ground, pure water. And by the time it gets down here to Louisiana before it goes into the Gulf of Mexico, it's extremely polluted. And it causes a dead zone, an area around that outlet where no life can survive in the water because of all the pollution. So it's a very big problem. There's different types of pollution. One type of pollution is called nutrient pollution, where excess nutrients that are helpful for growth and survival of organisms can lead to problems for other life forms. And we'll talk about these different sources of nutrient pollution and how they can cause problems for certain living things in the water. So when we're talking about nutrient pollution, we're really focusing on two different kinds of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. These are common in fertilizer, for example, but you'll also find them in waste products. And from other sources like machinery can release some of these things into the air that then get into the water and have problems. So the top sources here of nutrient pollution are sewage from our cities. Municipal sewage means from our cities and towns. Keeping in that path here, we have waste products from animals, so livestock waste. Aquaculture, that's fish farming. They also produce waste in the water. And then we have the runoff from agricultural fertilizers that help plants to grow. Too much of that can go into the water. And then drainage, so washing off of our lawns and other impervious surfaces can carry with it some of these pollutants into our waterways. And the negative effects this can have is it can lead to this process called eutrophication. And we'll talk about eutrophication and describe exactly what that is and problems it causes. So there are these small microscopic organisms that are plant-like called phytoplankton. These perform photosynthesis, they live in the water, and they require nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. Well, if you get too much nitrogen or phosphorus, these phytoplankton can bloom. Bloom is basically an explosion of their growth. They grow very, very, very quickly to the point where, as you can see here, they cover the entire surface with this, layer of algae, of phytoplankton. And so besides being unsightly, why is this a big problem? Well, let's go through this step by step, this eutrophication process here. So step one is we have too many nutrients, too much nitrogen or phosphorus, making its way into the bodies of water. Plants, or more specifically, our phytoplankton, algae would be among that category or word used to describe it, they grow really quickly. As they grow, they produce oxygen, but they also are using some oxygen. When they die, they fall down to the bottom of that body of water, and decomposers break them down, using up even more of the oxygen. So we get to the point where there's not enough oxygen left in the water for fish and other life forms to survive, and so they begin to die. And you can have these entire fish kills potentially, that can entire lakes where the fish can all die due to extreme eutrophication. And you can see here this statistic: over half the lakes in Asia, Europe, and North America are affected by some degree of eutrophication. So making sure that we try to reduce the input of these nutrients into the water is very important. And that can be done by reducing fertilizer usage, by not putting food down your garbage disposal. That actually goes into our waterways and increases nitrogen and phosphorus. by cleaning your car at a car wash, not in your driveway or the road or anything like that, because those detergents also carry with them nitrogen and phosphorus and other things as well. To finish up this video, we'll talk about mercury. Mercury is a toxic metal, and it's extremely toxic for young children, for example. You want to be very careful about mercury not getting into their systems because it causes neurological problems. They don't develop normally, and they'll have brain problems later on. And so where does mercury mainly come from? Well, when we burn fossil fuels, especially coal, mercury can be released. Now, a lot of factories in the United States have filters that help to capture that mercury so it doesn't get released, so it's not as huge of a problem compared to some countries where it's more unrestricted. Also, there can be mining that's done that releases mercury into the water and other things like gold mining you can see down here. It gets up into the air, the mercury mixes with water moisture, falls down as rain, and it gets into our water. And then we'll talk about how those levels can get increased as you go through the food chain. We'll go through an activity or talk about this in class actually in an in-person lecture. Mercury is also found in e-waste. E-waste is electronic waste. So old cell phones, tablets, laptops, etc. They have all kinds of different hazardous wastes that are present inside of them. They're not dangerous to us when we're using them because they're trapped inside these cases. But if these get disposed of in landfills and things like that, eventually they get broken and break down and are released into the environment. And we're only focusing on mercury. That's the one we want to think about here as being in e-waste and can cause a problem. You can see here we produce 3.3 million tons of electronic waste every year. A lot of this is shipped off to other countries who dispose of it for us. And so we don't see the effects here as much, but it's kind of terrible. We're paying other countries to take our waste. Additionally, you might not have known this, but if you have any of these light bulbs over here, these are called CFLs. CFLs is short for compact. Sorry, my pen stopped working there. Compact fluorescent lights. CFLs, compact fluorescent lights, contain mercury. Actually, all fluorescent lights contain small amounts of mercury. And so you do not want to dispose of these in the trash. Instead, you want to bring these to a disposal site. So there are a number of different disposal sites that will accept these for free. And one of those is Home Depot. You can see here listed. Home Depot, Lowe's will accept it for recycling. Oftentimes it's when you go into their entryway before you get to the returns center, you'll find a spot where you put this inside of a plastic bag and you drop it into the container. It's actually illegal to throw these in the trash. And if one of them should break in your house, up here are some guidelines or apartment as to how to actually clean that area to make sure that mercury is not there, potentially causing problems. Again, it's especially important for young children. So be careful with these light bulbs. They're more energy efficient, which is why we use them. But because they have this hazardous waste in them, they're not the best option. LEDs, light-emitting diodes, are actually far safer. They're cleaner. There's no mercury in them. They're more expensive, though. That's the downside. And so hopefully we're transitioning to more LEDs, and they'll become cheaper in the future as more get produced.